Alright, so today we're going to be looking at Bendy and the Ink Machine Out of Bounds, and trying to find as many different things as we can possibly find. Very cool news I have for you though. It's none other than TheMeatly himself, creator of Bendy and the Ink Machine. He's going to answer a couple questions about what we found here today. So it seems like I'm going to be echoing a couple things that you've seen in other YouTube videos, because for a good while there was a no-clip tool made by FC Makes Games Better. One of the most common discoveries that was brought to my attention on Twitter were these unique cardboards of Bendy that were in each map. These Easter eggs were likely put in for folks, not unlike myself, because it doesn't seem there's any legitimate way to find these. And the sign always reads, "Wandering is a terrible sin." In Chapter 2, just before you meet Bendy himself, there is an upper area in this hallway, and if you were to take the camera up and through here, you can find another one. And this one's kind of interesting because it has Bendy heads on the floor. However, if we were to clip the camera through the floor, you could still see that they were the full statues, which makes sense. Sometimes developers will repurpose existing objects and clip them through environments to just kind of serve a new purpose. Anyways, in Chapter 3, this one's behind the closed gates of Level 11's lunchroom. And then for some reason in Chapter 4, there's two of them. There's that scene where Bendy gives you the jump scare in the vents, and if you take the camera in the room where Bendy is, and just move a little bit around the corner here, you can see one of them here. But then there's one here that's even more interesting. If you go through the pipe and then go through the boulders, you can see a crying lost one with yet another Wandering Sin Easter egg. In Chapter 5, there's one inside the administration maze, and then in the archives, the little bonus thing after you complete the game, there's one last one on the opposite side of this wall here. Surprisingly, there's even something to talk about with the ink machine itself. Even though the machine shows up in every single chapter of the game, you never get to see the back of it by normal means. Yes, you can see the back of the prototype version in the archive, but the final version, again, never gets shown from the back, and you'd be surprised to find out that there's a giant piece of scotch tape that reads ink on the back, and obviously placed over the container of ink. Anyways, before we move on to our guest, let's do a zoom out of Chapter 1. Probably a great opportunity to also say thank you to Jade for making an actual free camera, as well as Codename Gamma for fixing the no-clip camera. Alright, let's start talking about Bendy himself. So there's going to be a whole bunch of scenes that if I don't address them, people are just going to start asking about them in the comments section. So let's get a few of the underwhelming mysteries out of the way. In this tunnel here, Bendy gives you a jump scare, and then he walks off to the side, and you don't get to see where he goes. Well, unfortunately, he just kind of disappears once he reaches this point. And then there's this scene where Bendy fights the projectionist, and after that he starts dragging him away. You might be a little bit surprised to find out that he doesn't in fact go inside the wall that the ink indicates once you leave the hiding spot. And also, if you were to go to the spot where you first see Bendy in Chapter 2, you can find a floating ink drop that just hangs out here, and it'll remain there until you trigger the scene. And right at the very end of the game, you might remember that Bendy transforms into an even more sinister form. Well, there's a lot going on underneath the ground during this scene. When regular Bendy drops down, there's an unused animation that can't be seen by the player. And also, before Bendy drops down, the new version is laying in wait, and when it's his turn to be called in, he just rises out of the ground. And people wanted to know what it looked like when Bendy runs through the halls during that fight where you have to flip all the switches. Well, there's only one version of Bendy, and he does warp from spot to spot, and you can see that illustrated very easily here from up above. There was something going on inside of him. Was it his teeth? There's something inside his body. What is that? And now let's get TheMeatly on here to answer a good question for us. Inside of the Bendy model, there's untextured prisms. It almost looks like a spinal column, which is so odd. No other character model in the game has something like this, so I'm really curious what the reason is for this.
So actually, this is just a simple representation of the Ink Demon's spine. More specifically, the animation bones used for twisting around to make him move. When the game is running, we usually tell the computer not to render these kind of things. At least we know now that the Ink Demon has quite a strong backbone.
By the way, I know a lot of you don't use the subscription box, but if you end up liking this video and you want to see more content like it in the future, pressing the subscribe button will increase the chances of you seeing a future episode on your homepage to about a 1 in 14 chance, as opposed to some astronomically low statistic. And if you just did, or you've been subscribed in the past, it means a lot. Definitely helps out a ton. So in the archives, there's various different models that were used and not used. In the case here, we have the Concept Bendy. And one of the interesting things about Concept Bendy is that his teeth are oddly textured. You might notice that the teeth on the left-hand side has a strange pattern, while the ones on the right seem to look more like traditional teeth. Well, if you take the camera inside the model, you can see that these teeth use the texture of the maw, whereas the teeth on the opposite side use the texture of Bendy itself. They even seem to adorably have Bendy's eyes on the back. And you might remember this scene before the projectionist gets his just desserts. As you get onto the staircase, he comes up from behind you, and this is what it looks like when he spawns in. Only for a couple frames, you can see that the model is facing in the exact opposite direction of where the player is. Speaking of the projectionist, there was a little mystery here. Outside this room with the trains, there's a single platform. And at the time, I didn't quite understand why this was here. And so I'm going to pass it over to TheMeatly so he can answer that question for us.
Okay, so this one is interesting. This floating piece of floor is a landing point for the projectionist. Around one point in Chapter 4, the player has to pull a switch to remove him from the world, only to have him suddenly appear again. So instead of removing him from the world and having to reload the projectionist back in, we simply teleported him to this little island until he was needed again. Hopefully he didn't get too lonely.
And then there's the boat scene with the giant bendy hand. If you take the camera underneath the ground here, you can see that the cutscene hand never goes away. He stays in place for the rest of the chapter. And now let's talk about Boris for a bit. If you take the camera inside of Boris's snout, you can see that the artist that designed the eyes for Boris left behind uneven brushstrokes for the eyes, knowing full well that the snout would be covering it up anyway. In fact, you can see something incredibly similar with Tom as well. If you look at these two side by side, you can see that Tom uses the same art asset as Boris, only it was slightly edited to just make the eyes look angrier. And here's what it looks like when Boris goes into the vent. In the story, he goes through there to open the door for you. But during this time, you can see the character model freeze in place and then disappear. And then there's the first encounter with Boris. You might remember that he's off camera and then he kicks a can, and then he walks out into the scene. Well, in truth, the can moves on its own and Boris doesn't kick it at all. And the only time he moves at all is when he's walking into view. In this scene with the Twisted Angel, if you look at the console that she's using, there's a unique texture that's never seen by the player. It's the sort of thing that you might see on a terminal, so nothing too special. It's just that, again, if you ever wanted to see what it looked like, there you go. Anyways, with that said, let's do a zoom out of Chapter 3. Alright, this next segment is going to be all about Sammy. So the first thing I want to show you is here in Chapter 2. Get to the very end of the chapter and all of a sudden you get bonked in the back of the head. And you can see that Sammy hit you with a dust pan. Viewing this scene from another angle will at least show you that Sammy's not there when you get bonked, but he does spawn into place while the screen fades to black. And also, when your character model gets moved to a completely different part of the map, this version of Sammy stays in place, which means that there is a second Sammy in an entirely different spot. And in fact, at any point in the chapter, if you were to visit that room where the second Sammy is, you can find him in an A pose. But anyways, once you actually reach this room by normal means, Sammy does his monologue and goes into another room in which you cannot follow him. Taking the camera inside there shows you that Sammy's there the entire time, and there's also a microphone and a desk. Obviously, he's using that microphone to use the PA that you end up listening to after he leaves. And before we move on to another chapter, here's what happens when you see Sammy for the first time in Chapter 2 carrying the Bendy cutout. Unfortunately, it's not terribly exciting, he just sort of disappears once he's out of the player's view. Anyways, here in Chapter 5, you might remember that he busts out here and starts attacking you, and then when you win the fight, he tricks you, throws you to the ground, and then you're saved. And you might be asking yourself, where do the other characters come in? Well, Tom spawns underneath the ground and then rises out of it, whereas Allison just spawns just off camera and then just walks in. And once again, here's some weird rules for Sammy. In Chapter 5, if at any point you go to his hiding spot, you can see that he's waiting there the entire time, whereas most enemies will be spawned in. Anyways, with that said, here is a zoom out of Chapter 2. Now let's talk about environments, and one of the weirdest things I found on this episode was that where the ink machine is, you can find a single untextured square hanging in front of the machine. Now this only appears when you go out of bounds from a scene that's way further away from the machine itself. Obviously, something like this gotta bring back on TheMeatly. What is it exactly that we're looking at here?
This is what we call a trigger quad. Obviously it's invisible during actual gameplay, but this specific one triggers the first appearance of the ink demon when he pops out and grabs you. Basically, we're telling the programming that it's the right point in the gameplay, and you're looking at this quad, you're about to get a whole bunch of Bendy in your face. We don't use this method too much anymore, but it's definitely a good failsafe.
And then here's one that's really great. You go outside the boundaries, right? And there's this giant black log way off in the distance. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. But here's the fun of the show. The more you investigate it, the more you start to piece together what is happening here. And as I got closer, it looked like an ET finger with a little glowing bit at the end there. Still had no idea. But it wasn't until I got inside of the thing that I started to understand what we were looking at. This is the area that your character goes to every time they die. Apparently in every single chapter, they get transported miles above the level itself, which is pretty crazy. And here's a fun little fact. For as massive as Chapter 5's map is, if you were to go outside the boundaries of where you find the ink machine for the final time, that room is actually only a couple feet away from the start of the entire chapter. Considering the fact that this map is all interconnected, it's kind of wild to think that the end of the game is right near the start of the chapter. Then we got the light bulbs at the very end of the game. I was shocked by this. I've never seen anything quite like it. There's a level of detail to these light bulbs that I can promise you doesn't need to exist. There is wiring, there's hooks. It almost has the complete anatomy of a real light bulb. This is something that I think repeat viewers of Boundary Break will understand, that this is incredibly uncommon. Speaking of unnecessarily high detail, Joey Drew himself, if you take the camera inside of his head, you can start to clip through his eyeballs, and for some reason, the pupil is so well modeled that it actually goes concave into the eyeball itself. But I'm sorry, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. We're kind of not talking about environments at this point, but let me make up for that by showing you one of the coolest things I've seen for this episode. In this hallway, there's a barricade, and if you take the camera past the barricade, you can find a door that seems to be completely unused. Now, this is something you simply do not usually see in Bendy and the Ink Machine. Joey Drew Studios runs a pretty tight ship, and most of what you see is very intentional. So for this door to be here makes no sense, and that's why, once again, I took this opportunity to pick the brain of TheMeatly and see if there's any reason behind this.
The world of Bendy is obviously a little abstract, but we always want to put a bit of logic into it so everywhere feels like a very real place. So here we have a door added to show where other people could have gotten to this location if they didn't have a boat. Secondly, this hallway was created originally without the flooded ink in it, which was added after we wanted to put in some searchers. So again, logically, we know that Allison and Tom had just left the safe house, and we had just talked about not being able to touch the ink. So we had a door for them to go out at the end of this hallway, purely from the storytelling point of view. But in the end, we just put down some planks that explained where they walked on so they wouldn't have to get their feet inky.
And then we'll finish this off with something that nobody's really seen before, because once again, due to the complacency of people using a no-clip instead of a free camera, there's no way to see this, as using no-clip will lock your character in place for this final scene. That scene being when your main character goes through Joey Drew's door back into Chapter 1. People want to know how much of this area is rendered. The truth is, it's not. What you're looking at is a pre-rendered cutscene that your character's walking towards. You can even see the video compression if you get close enough. I'm gonna hand it over to TheMeatly so he can give you a special message. But if you want to see more out of bounds Bendy content, give me a follow on Twitch. I got my link here. I'll also put it in the video description. Next time I'm on stream, just spam more Bendy. If enough people do it, I will absolutely boot the game back up and show you anything that you feel like I missed. Anyways, thank you everybody, but especially thank you to TheMeatly. The floor is yours, my friend. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for cracking open Bendy and the Ink Machine today, guys. This game was a crazy fun time in our lives, and frankly, we're in another crazy fun time right now working on its sequel. Maybe we'll have to break open that game sometime too. In the end, the amount of Bendy fans still grows every single day, and I'm personally so touched how many people love this game and this world and our characters. I grew up loving video games, and I'm so proud to be part of gaming history now. All of us here are so grateful. I guess Joey Drew himself said it best. Dreams come true, guys. Thanks, everybody.